Hello, welcome to our webcast for we're going to have today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I was taking a look through the attendee list and I see we've got a lot of people from very, very wide-ranging areas. So we're glad to have you here and we appreciate you spending some time with us today. My name's Phil Hagan. I'll be heading up this webinar and I'll introduce our other panelists here in just a moment. But this is going to be the first of a three-part webinar series. We're going to really dive deep through this entire series of material and talk about how to build and improve a threat hunting program, specifically through incorporating MITRE's ATT&CK framework. I'll get you a lot more detail on that as we dive in here shortly. But this is going to be the first increment, as I said, and this increment is going to be how to mature a threat hunting program. So we're actually taking a little bit of a view, a bit down the road, if you will, and want to start looking at the end state or the steady state of that threat hunting program. And then we're going to kind of do a bit of a rewind through some of the others and talk about building that up and then refining that into an ongoing process. So slightly disjunct in terms of timing, but I promise it's going to make a lot of sense for you in the end. And that said, we are very, very excited about this. So let me introduce our panelists. I'm joined today by, first of all, John Wonder, and John comes to us from MITRE, and he is part of the ATT&CK team there, and he brings a career experience, including a lot of systems engineering, software development, and really is focused right now at MITRE on research and development tasks that are improving security of their clients and the community in general, which is certainly part of our theme today. I'm also glad to be on the panel today with Rick McElroy, and he is the security strategist at Carbon Black, as you can see. Rick brings a 20-year set of experience to us involving both consulting and staff security roles, everything from really, really down in the trenches all the way up to a CISO position as well. And now he helps to kind of shape the overall strategy of the Carbon Black product line and company, and certainly is a welcome addition here today. And then my name, again, is Phil Hagan, and I'm from the Red Canary side of the house, and I'm a DFIR, Digital Forensics and Incident Response Strategy Building role with Red Canary, and I'm also a senior instructor with SANS, where I write and teach the network forensic program. Well, I want to first turn this over to John. John, if you could kind of get in a little bit on the ATT&CK framework and really where it came from and what it's designed to address.
Yeah, sure, and thank you, Phil, and thanks everybody for joining. I'll just give a quick overview of what ATT&CK is in case you aren't already familiar with it. So to start off with, kind of where did we come about ATT&CK? Why did we come up with this idea? I like to describe it in terms of kind of the obligatory pyramid of pain. I feel like, half of presentations have to include this. I felt I might as well do it in this case. And really where ATT&CK came from is this idea that we've reached this realization in cybersecurity that what we are doing to detect the adversary isn't really working sufficiently right now. We try to detect, oftentimes today, things like hash values and IP addresses that end up being really easy for the adversary to change. This is what David Bianco had a blog post about this, and now you see this image all over the place. And I think we're all kind of realizing this now, and so MITRE kind of took that to heart, and in our own work, we tried to figure out, well, how can we start to move up the pyramid of pain? How can we start to do our detections of the things that are at the top of that are harder for the adversary to be able to change, and therefore, develop our own better detections and develop a better ability to hunt against those things at the top, the tactics, techniques, and procedures that adversaries use. And so we developed a set of red team, blue team exercises. Basically, at one of our sites, we carried out these exercises on operational networks, and we tried to describe, what the red team is doing and then how the blue team is detecting those things. And something we realized really quickly is that we didn't have a good vocabulary to use to describe those things. So when the red team would carry out an action, we needed to align that with the way the blue team had detected it and found that in our networks. And so that's where ATT&CK came from, is really that. It was about how do we describe what the adversary is doing in a way that we can communicate among all of these different teams. And if you go to the next slide, I can get into kind of the core philosophy behind what ATT&CK is about. So that was the driving use case. What is ATT&CK? ATT&CK is a knowledge base of adversary behavior. So what are the things that adversaries are doing to us when they attack us? And so ATT&CK really focuses on kind of the initial access, so how they're getting in all the way out towards how they're exfiltrating data and achieving command and control. So it's very much a post-exploit focus. One really important aspect of it is it's based on real-world observation. So we took a look at what our red teams were doing, and more importantly, ATT&CK really incorporates a lot of open source reporting. So every single thing you'll see in attack is backed by a reference to a report that's available publicly that we can all go read. So you know that the behaviors that are incorporated into attack are things that the adversaries are actually using. This isn't meant to be kind of a theoretical framework, not that theoretical frameworks are bad. This is meant to be a framework of things that are actually seen, or a knowledge base of things that are actually seen. Second, MITRE is a nonprofit. We operate research labs on behalf of the federal government and kind of work in the public interest. And in that public interest, kind of our mission there, we decided that we would make attack open source and available to the public. So we publish it on attack.mitre.org. If you go to that website, you get all of attack, everything that we've developed for that, all of the references to open source reports, all of the descriptions of what adversaries are doing, and links back to the adversary groups that are doing them, kind of all available for you to use, however it makes sense for your organization. We don't tell you how to use it. We make it available, and then you can use it in the way that makes sense to your organization. As I mentioned kind of at the beginning, it was developed really meant to be this common language between red and blue. It describes from an adversary perspective what they're doing in a way that you can then use that to align to your defenses. And so that common language aspect is also important. And lastly, attack has developed a really strong community. You know, we've had the opportunity to do this webcast with Phil and Rick and Red Canary and Carbon Black. And there's just been a great community built up of end user organizations and vendors that really see the value of attack. And that leads to a couple things. One, there's tools that use attack and leverage attack and have it built in. Second, a lot of the content in attack actually comes from you all. It comes from the community. So we have a lot of great threat intel analysts working at MITRE, but you all also have a lot of great threat intel analysts and defenders and red teamers. And we are able to kind of incorporate that into attack and then consolidate it and publish it back out, basically. And so our mission to provide attack free and open includes both us publishing it, but also, you know, being open to community feedback and rolling that in. So I've talked a lot about attack. Why don't we actually look at what attack is, and then we'll go from there. So if you go to the next slide, if you're familiar with attack, you must be familiar with the matrix. So the matrix is what we kind of our top level view into the attack knowledge base. Across the top, you have what we call the tactics, and tactics are kind of the core technical objectives. So the things adversaries want to achieve when they attack us. They want to be able to get initial access. They want to be able to execute commands and move laterally, and they want to be able to evade our defenses. So those items in blue are what they want to do. And then down the columns are the different ways that they can do that. So for example, maybe they want to get credential access. That's something they need in order to attack us. Some different ways of doing that are, you know, one example is they could brute force it. They could just try a bunch of passwords until one works. Another way that's, you know, super common right now is credential dumping. They can kind of read memory and use tools like Mimikatz to be able to pull all that in. And so down those columns are the different mechanisms they can use to achieve that tactical objective. And on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about kind of different ways people are using attack. We kind of see it as 4 different use cases, and I'll start in the top right here. So attack is really useful for threat intelligence. We see organizations today already describing their threat intelligence in the context of attack. And our goal with that, and why we think that's important, is that it then makes your threat intelligence directly applicable to your defenders. So I guess a question I'd have for, you know, the panelists, Rick or Phil, how do you see the incorporation of threat intelligence kind of playing into your hunting programs? How do you use threat intel to drive hunt? And how do you think attack can help with that, I guess?
Yeah, well, you know, Carbon Black, we're big believers in the behaviors of the attackers, not necessarily indicators of compromise, right? So I think since the inception of the organization, if you saw any of Ben Johnson's or Mike Moscuso's early talks, it was really about going after this, right? And so I think in particular to MITRE ATT&CK, what it gives us is a common language to start exchanging those. And that's going to make teams better. That's going to make products better across the board. I think it gives you a direct way to tell and measure whether or not your threat intelligence is driving better detection. And that's a thing that I think we haven't been able to define, frankly, or measure as an industry. Phil?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to sum that up. You know, going back to the tip of the pyramid of pain, we want to invest in processes, you know, threat intelligence generation, for example. It's going to be very durable. That stuff is very hard to generate. It's very hard fought to get that. So if you can define it in ways that are very durable, very long term, such as behaviorally, those TTPs again, I think it's an excellent way to really build the investment value, the durability that you're going to get out of that intelligence. So I think it's an excellent way to apply it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I like that you use the word durability. I think one thing that one problem we really have in cybersecurity a lot of the time is not really knowing how durable our defenses are, how well protected we are. We think we're protected, but is that really the case? And that's really where our adversary emulation and red teaming stuff can come in. And it's really all about kind of testing that. So you think you're defended against credential dumping. Why don't we try it and see what happens? And I know, Red Canary actually has a great framework for this that you've made open source called Atomic Red Team. Do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. The origin story there is pretty awesome, I believe. It was really designed initially or conceived of as a way to test our own platform. We wanted to make sure we were, as you mentioned, detecting credential dumping. So we wrote a number of ways to conduct credential dumping and then said, hey, are we able to see these? Pretty straightforward stuff. Well, we realized the community impact of that would be far, far greater than just our own little kind of sandbox, if you will. So we came up with ways to test each of these different behaviors. And there's sometimes many different ways to detect or to emulate the exact same behavior, because there's different ways the attackers are going to do that. But by categorizing them back into the attack behaviors themselves, it gives us, as you had mentioned, that kind of common language. So Atomic Red Team has been a fantastic thing to watch, watch the conception of, and then watch the growth and the community adoption of. And I think a big part of that is owing to the decision that was made very early on to use attack as a way of classifying those.
And Phil, on that particular topic, would you say it also helps to focus engineering on the back end around detectors? Because I think that's one of the impacts that it's had to Carbon Black, and frankly, probably every vendor that's looking at doing this is, you can actually focus on where you need to, not where you're guessing that you miss a certain detection.
Yeah, absolutely. They do go hand in hand. You take that threat intelligence report on a known threat actor, for example, and you kind of do the mapping that you see in the upper right-hand corner, saying, here's the behaviors this attacker is known to conduct, and if you believe you're targeted by them, it gives you an ideal kind of a shopping list almost of where you need to focus your detection, your prevention, and any of your other investigative procedures, which is a great way.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. That kind of does feed into then your engineering process of understanding, can I answer the question that my CISO is asking me? Am I defended against this attack that came out, last week against one of my competitors? That's another place we see, like all the time I see people posting these attack heat maps of different things, and that's really a great way of giving you a scorecard of how well you're doing. And we can think about that in a couple different ways. One of them is, as a SOC program, how well is our SOC doing at mitigating or defending against these threats that adversaries we know use? But then the second thing is, if you aren't where you want to be, how do you know how to get there? What are the right tools and products that you can buy or acquire, or, develop open source that will get you there? And I know one thing MITRE has done in this area is we've, out of our Let's program, which does a lot of work with commercial industry, we've started to do some product evaluations against the attack framework. And I think Carbon Black was actually in one of the first rounds of that. So Rick, do you have any thoughts on how that's been from you as a vendor perspective?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, one, I would make the argument that a taxonomy like MITRE ATT&CK instantly made most of the competition down there on the endpoint better, or it should have, at least if they were paying attention, right? So I think one of the areas I would love to see this have an impact on is third-party testing. Right, so I think if you and we'll get into this, and I think part 2 gets into this a bit, right? So starting to automate some of this testing and detection. I think if we can look at that for third parties, because not every team is actually capable of doing that out there. So putting a framework in where we can get equal results for equal testing, right, would be fantastic to see too. So I know Carbon Black, we're pushing pretty hard for
that. Yeah, that makes sense. So I think, really getting back to kind of the theme of this series of webinars, back to detection and hunting. This is really a huge part of what attack is being used for right now. And with that, I'd kick it back over to Phil to talk a little bit about his thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And before I shift on to the next one, there were a couple of good questions that I wanted to try and address because we're at a really good place for that. First of all, how is this intended to be used? I think, the use cases that are laid out, they definitely cover the gamut between red and blue. So there's no one preferred way to do that. And now that we have that common language, I think it's a way we can start to blend those two different perspectives together. You know, we're speaking the same language, we can obviously work together a lot better as well. And then another good one that came in was actually, you know, how does this differ from another framework that a lot of people are familiar with, which is going to be the cyber kill chain. Did you have just a couple of seconds you wanted to try and address that real quick, John? Because I think that they go hand in hand, but I'm interested here for your perspective on that.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and we get that a lot, obviously. So one of the things that attack tries to do is take the cyber kill chain and the great work that's gone into that and kind of take it down a level. So the cyber kill chain focuses on, like, how does the adversary go about executing a successful attack? What are the chains that they need to achieve to do that? But then what we try to do with attack is try to say, what are the behaviors that they use to achieve any one of those things? So if they, for example, want to, you know, gain initial access, what are the different ways that they can use? What are the different ways that they can do that? If they're carrying out actions on objectives, they need to execute commands. What are the different ways that they execute commands? So we kind of drop down a level of abstraction into like, what are the behaviors that they're doing? So I wouldn't necessarily say you should use one or the other. I think they're both great. It just depends on what you want to do with it, how much detail you actually need for what your use cases are.
Yeah, I think that covers it really well. It's almost like there's a subset or a more granular kind of approach with attack, and it just depends on who you're speaking to and what your task is, I think. So great way to phrase that.
Right.
There are a bunch of questions in here that are about the product evaluation. I'm going to actually ask folks with those questions. We're going to come back to those a little bit later on. I think they're great, but those are going to probably be something that's a little bit better focused toward MITRE's specific process there. So John, just want to let you know there's a lot of interest, and I know you've got a lot of information coming out pretty soon here. So I think you got some very hungry consumers for that info when it's available. I want to shift over though to talk about kind of how we've done things for decades, kind of since the first person who put computer insecurity or network insecurity together. Generally, we had some kind of a process that looked like this. We had a system, some kind of automated process that would generate an alert, some kind of event detection, or some kind of a rule fires on the IDS. Firewall rule looks concerning enough, or firewall hit looks concerning for whatever reason. It has to go to some kind of human review. One of the big challenges that we've always had is this technology, as great as it is really, really loud. So there's so many different detections you're going to have, so many alerts to handle, that the analyst has to go through them and determine which ones are worth more processing. This is really kind of the foundation of our tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 system that so many of us are going to be familiar with. That very early stage noisy detections, then you're moving into something a little bit less, and it's this kind of funneling kind of a process. And as we start to change the way we do things and start to change the way we describe our processes, we're hearing words like monitoring, specifically continuous monitoring becomes a big one. That's starting to become that background process, right? It's running all the time, it's collecting, and we're maybe looking over that with some kind of rudimentary signatures. And then we've got operations. So after the monitoring happens, your security operations process kicks in, and that's going to be this kind of well-documented series of events. It's going to follow that incident response plan, probably. There's a lot of ways to describe this, but I think you get the idea of how this is typically going to come together. Now, what I think is really kind of cool is now that we add on this layer of threat hunting, where does that really come in? Well, threat hunting requires some kind of intelligence to start. And generally, that intelligence is going to be generated as a byproduct of an investigation or an incident response process. Then what we're going to see is threat hunting is a retrospective process that's taking existing data that's been collected way back in the monitoring side here, and we're applying that new intelligence to say, hey, let me go back through the last 3 or 6 months worth of whatever kind of data, net flow, log data, endpoint telemetry, and let me see if I have any of my threat intelligence that I now have in hand that shows up back then. That's going to kind of be this ongoing background process. And it's really interesting to see that come to be, because now we've got so many new opportunities to go back in time and kind of rewind our evidence, which I think is a blast. So that's how we're going forward with our idea of threat hunting. And as we want to apply that in the real world, this is one that I think will be kind of interesting. Let's say you get some kind of a threat intelligence report, whatever it might be. I think, Rick, you're pretty familiar with the APT 1234 group, right?
Yeah, fuzzy animal is a bane right now. You know, they're breaking into
Yes,
all kinds of things, and especially with
everybody's
Swiss
talking
banking.
about it. Who wouldn't want to, right? Well, let's say that that threat intelligence report contains something that's really interesting to you and I. And let's say it comes in and says, you know what, they're really well known to use PowerShell. Once they get in, it's PowerShell this, that, all the time. Well, you and I might take that as a very important piece of threat intelligence, and we should. And we might want to say, well, how am I going to hunt for that? How am I going to look for it? Well, maybe I can look for any place PowerShell.exe is running as a process name, or look for an MD5 value. That becomes potentially a really good kind of a way to look for that, because, well, if they're using PowerShell, it's got to show up as, you know, something on the endpoint on the operating system, right? Well, as well intentioned as that is, let's take a look at what the actual impact is going to be. Oh man, you know, would you say 15,000 events per day in this, in a, it's a 100,000 endpoint environment, would be a low or a high number? What do you guys think?
I'm gonna say low. I mean, it depends on how fancy the IT team is, but I'll say 15K is low for 100K endpoints. Yeah.
I think it depends on how free you are with your users. Yeah.
See, you bring up an excellent point, John. It depends on how free you are with the users. You know, you've got to know what's normal in the environment before you can really specify the anomalies, right? Well, is PowerShell something that your administrators or maybe your users are permitted to leverage on a daily basis? Well, that's certainly going to change how many you're going to see, and it's going to change how many you've got to go through. But what if the attacker gets just a little bit crafty? They don't even have to be very crafty at all. Let's say they just add a new line to the end of that that executable. It's still going to run in most cases. Some situations it won't, but we'll leave those out of the scope for right now. And what we're going to see is they change the hash value, or they change the file name to ps.exe, or any number of things that they're going to do here. Man, that becomes even more complicated. So not only do we have, you know, more than 15,000 alerts per day in this notional environment, now I don't even know how many I'm missing, how many I'm losing. So I've got false positives, I've got missed positives, so I've got false negatives there. I've got all kinds of problems across the board. So as well intentioned as this was, we've got a long way to go before that becomes something that we can really take advantage of. So let's take another step and let's overlay that with what we now understand about the attack matrix and defining attackers' behaviors, instead of focusing on these very, very specific indicators. And we get something that looks like this. And this is pulled from one of our detections that we use that's looking specifically for PowerShell, but with a very specific type of behavior. PowerShell that's downloading something using an HTTP or an HTTPS URL somewhere in the command line. So you can see on the right-hand side, we've got some logical combinations, and I'm sure you can trace your way through those pretty quickly. But I want to draw your attention to what we're doing on the left. We're not just describing the technical details of this. We're actually putting in here what this detector does, and we're also including that attack category. So one of them from the execution channel is going to be PowerShell, plain and simple. So this is 1086. Happens to be one that we're going to detect a couple of different ways, but this is going to be a much more rich means of identifying that suspicious behavior. And we're going to come back to this one in just a minute, because I want to show you what this looks like after it fires in conjunction with some other things. But given this kind of information, Rick, I wonder if you could talk just a little bit to some of the data that we're going to have to collect in order to perform this search in the first place.
Yeah, 100%. So the behaviors are interesting, and I like kind of the way you walked the audience through that, right? So hey, you start with a very broad funnel, and you start to cull that down based on the activities that are actually occurring, not the hashes that are occurring or the executables themselves. And so look, I think the fundamental premise of Carbon Black is and always will be to record the right things on the endpoint, to be able to put these together. I think you also talked about retrospective. You know, one of the things that I talked to our IR partners with while we were out at the Threat Hunting Summit and then over in the UK specifically is how long some of these attacks are taking, and some of this dwell time that the attackers have before they actually start to execute stuff. So look, all that being said, if you have a system in place that can record the right data, and so what do I mean by the right data? Well, look, you know, some of the biggest categories in attack, you're going to be able to find those through things like new network connections from the endpoint. That's going to be able to reveal the techniques, tactics, and procedures of lateral movement, right? Cross-process interaction. Is PowerShell calling another process, which then starts to do something nefarious, which would break this particular detector? Those are things you're going to have to look at. So I think keeping all of that data centrally and being able to do it quick is really, that's all going to give time back to your team and help you hunt faster and actually help you drive these detectors faster in your environment too, right? So yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you said like the speed thing on there too. One of the big themes that I like to cover in my class is our goal as investigators is to get to good findings fast. And if we're not doing both of those, then we got some real problems. So the speed of being able to do this is certainly very important. And you know, to kind of dovetail in with a question that we had received as well, you know, somebody had asked, you know, how do we know when to stop? How do we know when to chase something down? And the answer goes back to that threat intelligence. You know, the idea here is to really focus things down. So your hunt procedures, your very low level procedures that you're running at, are shaped around that threat intelligence. The idea here is not, hey, I've got 30 gigs of log files, let me just greph through them. You know, that's not hunting. That's insanity is what I think that is. But that's going to be, you know, again, going back to what you had said, Rick, about, you know, find the speed and then, you know, be able to do that in a focused manner. So really, really cool application, I think. Let's kind of look at the next stage here. I want to talk just a moment here and get some thoughts on the hunting maturity model. The hunting maturity model has been defined a number of times. We're using the SANS definition here, which tends to be one that's fairly well understood, pretty straightforward. But you'll see that at each different stage of developing a hunting program, we've got two things that we're doing. We've got a level of automation and optimization, which is going to go to that speed thing that we were just mentioning. But you'll also see the second row down there at the bottom talks about how much data is collected on an ongoing basis. And that's going to be the fundamental question of a continuous monitoring program. And what I was really fascinated about the first time I saw this was the fact that going from 0 to 1 and 1 to 2, the second row down at the bottom there, talking about the data collection, you're increasing the amount of data that you're collecting. But at maturity model 2, level 2, at that point, you're already doing everything you need in the collection side in order to get to 3 and 4, which means getting from 2 to 3 and then 4 is going to require focusing on your analysis procedures, where you're building your own, where you're leveraging threat intelligence in different ways, and really focusing and speeding up and automating the processes. So that to me was really cool, because it tells me that you want to make a decision early on in your process of building a program here that's going to really prioritize collection of data. And you know, some of those data points that you had just mentioned, Rich, I thought were great. They were really talking to, you know, some of those atomic low-level pieces of information off the operating system. This optimization, though, is really where I want to focus on next. And we're going to do a little bit of a throw forward look into one of the next webcasts that we have. But I want to take those two concepts of the parallel development processes of building the procedures and then building the data collection. And I really want to make that even more generic, because you can take either of those and you can say, you know, most any maturity model, I can summarize up by saying it's crawl, walk, run. So I don't want anybody out there right now to think what I'm talking about is something you need to do from the first moment you decide to have a hunt teaming program. Because what you're going to see is this is a very iterative process. There's no end node here. This is a bit of foreshadowing into our third part that we're going to have in this webcast series. But one of the cool things in here is this is not much different than any investigative process pretty much since the beginning of time, since the first person had a question that they wanted to answer, you know, back, I'm sure, in caveman days. What about some of these different modules, or nodes, specifically the ones on the right? You know, these become great ways for us to overlay some of those attack-based behaviors, the categorizations. And I'm hoping to get some input here on what you think about the overall investigative process and where you see specifically attack kind of best to inject into that, and kind of give people an idea of what we're going to be covering as we get into the other parts of the series here.
Yeah, sure. So I think, so attack is never going to tell you what you need to look for. It doesn't tell you what's going to be important to your organization. It tells you, the universe of things that adversaries are doing, and you can then formulate which of those are important to me and my organization. But then once you have that, once you know what you want to hunt for and know what behaviors you want to look for, attack can really help you. A lot of the knowledge in attack. So I showed you the matrix, but if you click on each of those elements on our page, it gives you a lot of information about how to go about detecting those things and kind of what are the questions, what are the ways that adversaries are using this so that you can then formulate that malicious usage. So for example, we saw, PowerShell was downloading a script, and that's kind of a very suspicious thing to be doing a lot of the time, is to be directly executing code that you downloaded online. And so that's one of the ways that adversaries use it. And so it's one of those interesting questions and hypotheses. Well, what if we looked for PowerShell, but to filter it down to only when it's being downloaded online? And a lot of the threat intelligence that we link to from attack, and also a lot of the threat intelligence that's just out there, can really tell you a lot about what those hypotheses should be, and then kind of frame them in a way that you can then execute on it and be able to say, for this one specifically, we're looking for this specific type of PowerShell, and kind of narrow down what you're looking for, because you don't want to cast too wide a net or you'll capture, too many things.
Yeah, and I think just to piggyback on that, Phil, you can also take your realistic threat assessment, i.e., what vertical what APT actors do I necessarily have to worry about? Which ones don't I? And start to line those with, like, hey, you're already calling out a few because your realistic threat assessment says you don't have to worry about Silk Dragon or whoever the case may be. And so your hypothesis becomes shorter and shorter, and then you can focus on the assets that maybe are at risk because they travel to certain areas where the case may be. But I think when you look at the techniques of those actors, attack gives you a great taxonomy to just like go after those and see if you can detect them on that particular endpoint too.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. And I also like to try and describe what we do in this line of business as like 95% refinement of a hypothesis or following leads. And then that last couple of percent is really the findings, that's crossing the finish line. So this iterative process really becomes something very important to understand and something to try and internalize, to put it mildly. So yeah, good points. Well, let's kind of go back real quick. I want to talk about this right here. This is a detection that was actually identified. And I want to first kind of just give you a tiny little window, small screenshot into that detection. Both of you guys, if you were looking at this, what would you say about this detection? If I told you this was a part of a detection we were giving a customer without knowing anything else behind it than what's in the screenshot. Any thoughts off the bat?
Mimi cats is bad, MK. It's sort of my first filter. For me, I always think about all of the new folks that were thrown in seats, right? So 26 million jobs open, a lot of analysts, a lot of new people who don't understand the behavior of actors and don't hang out with red teamers like I do, right? So when I start to think about this, I think about that analyst sitting there and 1,000 alerts, or to your earlier point, 15,000 alerts. And then something like this pops. For me, again, it becomes, I can quickly weed out the noise. Hey, this is a lot of stuff, but this looks really bad. And so based on a general assumption that this looks really bad because there's multiple detectors triggers, I can focus on that and then move to disrupt faster than I would. Say if it just said, PowerShell is downloading strings via URL, right? If I had 10 of those, which ones do I wait? I mean, I got to know the asset criteria and stuff. So for me, it becomes, again, about speed to market and time on that.
Yeah, I love that idea. I love that idea of like chaining detections together to understand that this isn't just only downloading something from a URL. It's also, invoking Mimikatz and all these other things. I also like that, having numbers here is great because not every bad thing you see in the environment is the same degree of bad. And, some things you're going to see at a low level, and maybe sometimes they're bad. Maybe other times they're not, and other things like Mimikatz. If you see Mimikatz, it's almost certainly not good.
Yeah, you're going to have a bad day. Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up a great point there, John, which is the scoring that's on these too. Like our example that we showed you before with that detector a couple of slides back, that really didn't give us a high degree of concern. You see, that's at the very bottom. It's a 1.84. But if I take those observations, just the numbers, which I think you both made some excellent points on, and if I take and overlay those with which of the attack methods, the attack behaviors are here, now we've got a whole different level of concern because we already had the scoring, but I see that there's 4 PowerShell-based detectors that are firing, and then there's one that talks about a different behavior, and of course that being Mimikatz. Now, you can replace that with whatever other credential dumping specific utility you're interested in, but you chain these things together, and now we start to see that there is behavior involving both of these 2 tools, one potentially legitimate, one clearly not. And this gives us a much higher degree of concern. I mean, I think anybody that saw this initially probably would have thought about alarm bells pretty quickly on. But I think at this point, there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever. And then the detection that actually had these detections here that were actually fired based on the command line that you see on the left-hand side. Unless you're looking at every single command line, you're not going to be able to identify that invoke Mimikatz method was used here. So we've got the ability to do that, and looking at this one event through potentially thousands of different search detectors and seeing that these 5 fired with these 5 scores really gives us that time to market that that you had mentioned, Rick. And I think that the specificity and the speed here is getting back again to those good findings fast goal that I'd kind of mentioned a little bit earlier on. Well, what if that was actually legit for whatever reason? Now, I get it. If we're seeing Mimikatz, we're probably not. So let's look just at the PowerShell URL downloading. How are you going to make that less work for you for the legitimate, the authorized events? And what we actually build into to our platform is what we've called suppression. Not an uncommon concept, but we have built the ability to suppress things based on a number of characteristics. Maybe that's going to be for a specific user. Maybe it's going to be a specific system or group of systems. You have the ability to very fine-grained control, with very fine-grained control, identify what you're going to suppress and then what you're going to allow through. Because, I mean, I'm sure there's nobody who's done this business for more than a couple of months that hasn't accidentally suppressed true evil. We were actually talking about that the other day, right, Rick, and that happens, right? So what are some of the ways that you see suppression really driving our speed and our focus and our optimization?
Yeah, well, I think you can't get to speed and efficiency without doing a fantastic job at suppression, right? And then when you think about it, if you have 2 people and keeping notes on all the things you suppressed and why you did it probably isn't going to be that hard. When you actually have a team of analysts and then tier 2 and tier 3 and all those escalation things, I mean, just keeping track of the notes on why it was suppressed, reviewing that, going back over time, does that still hold true given the environment or given the user? Maybe the user changed departments. Maybe they have access to more things than they used to before, so it's a little riskier. But yeah, I would certainly say if you look at the evolution of Knox to SOX to sort of the status quo today, yeah, it's something we were doing quite a bit of because after all, 1,000 alerts that were wrong in a row are going to get ignored. That 1,001st one that comes in is the one that gets you, right. So I think having a process for this and really just thinking of it, and I think you said this earlier, Phil, it's a continuous loop. You can't do it without it, and it's really going to help your team too. And then think about your tier 3 people are going to leave one day and you're going to have new tier 1 people. And so again, managing that and having effective notes in the quickest possible way for the analysts who can go in and make that determination is going to be crucial for the team in the stock. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. It's I guess you can look at that 2 ways. It's a never-ending cycle, or it's a gainful employment for the rest of our careers. So I'll take the latter look at it if I ever have the opportunity. Let me give this back over to John real quick. We talked about measurement, and we've got 2 different slides on measurement. I wanted to get your perspective on this, and we've got a bit of a bigger view here on that heat map, and hope you can speak to that a little bit in your experience there, John.
Yeah, sure. So as I said at the beginning, one of, I think at least, the biggest problems we have in security is that we don't understand really how well we're doing a lot of the time, and we have trouble communicating that up to our leadership. So, answering questions from leadership is a key part of all of our jobs, really, in addition to doing the operational work. And one of the things that we have found with Attack is that it does give you that scorecard in a way that is really communicable to senior leadership and to others on your team and to others on similar teams. And so maybe they don't understand what every single box on this means, but they know that, green is better than red. And if I see more of those boxes turning, closer towards green, I'm in good shape. If I see more of them turning closer towards red, maybe I need to think about doing something different. And so bringing that level of measurability and really engineering, I think, towards the security operations space is really important. It gets back to what you both were just talking about too, in terms of writing down what you're doing and maintaining that. So as you have staff changeovers, they understand what's happening. And we don't want to have this inbuilt knowledge be required to, I know, I was here last week and I saw it. We don't want to have that. We want to have this stuff written down in a formalized way, and ATT&CK gives you that way of writing it down. It doesn't tell you what to write down or how to do it, but it does give you kind of that framework in which to put all of this knowledge.
Yeah, and I think, what would be cool, Phil and John, like honestly for me, is we use mean time to detect all the time, right? Be cooler tactically to measure my team on mean time to detect persistence or mean time to detect privilege escalation. And again, I think this is an easy way to explain to your executives, like what we're actually trying to do is make their jobs harder. And so if we can make them do more manual work further up that chain, like at initial access, it'd be awesome if they had to iterate 8 million times, right? They'd probably leave me alone. So John, to your point, that language barrier, which is huge, being able to easily, I think, explain it and then easily point to, here's the areas that we're improving, or here's the areas we need to improve on. And then you can go drive budgets around logging and actually getting the right telemetry and whatever you need in your program.
Yeah, it's a common theme that we see is, if you're measuring something, then you can operationalize it, you can act on it. If you're not measuring it, if you're not taking your detections and classifying them according to some common language, we're of course using ATT&CK here as the preferred one, you're not going to be able to get that extra pivot into the data. And there's a lot of different ways we can measure that, right? So one of them that we'll set up next here is how important is that detector? How valuable? What's the impact of that? And this is a little bit of foreshadowing into actually the second series that we're going to have, and I'll talk about when that is coming up here in just a couple of moments. But yeah, if you're not measuring it, how many times does this detector fire? How many times does it end up being an actual event of concern? So like your false positive rate, right? And if you're able to then overlay that with all those different behaviors from the ATT&CK matrix, it's going to again show you where it's time for you to invest your detection, your prevention, your other capabilities. So I think that's a really cool kind of a way to phrase this out. And it goes back into not only evaluating your processes and your engineering, as John had mentioned earlier on, but also going into your internal capabilities and identifying where your gaps are. So we're going to have a ton more on this, on that measurement and determining the impact of the stuff that you're doing on part 2 of the webinar. But I wanted to kind of dovetail that in here for everybody so they know what's coming up as well. Well, we are to a point where we've got some sections for questions, and we have got some good ones coming in here. So I'm going to go through a little bit on these. One of the questions that came in is, when is the recording going to be available? I'll just say watch your email for that, because we will email that out as soon as we have the recording finalized for you. But here's a question which came in, and we're looking specifically about obfuscation. Where did that one go? Here we go. So the question says, can you comment on how to deal with obfuscation of the command line? Something we're seeing very commonly these days. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this goes all the way back to like injecting backspaces into telnet traffic back in the early 90s, of how you're obfuscating your data flow. There's a lot of different ways we can deal with that with suppression, but do either of you guys want to take a stab at that question and how we as responders or defenders can address those kinds of mechanisms the attackers have to hide?
Yeah, I'll start super high level and say, if you aren't recording what binaries or what command lines are doing down there, and Windows is just passing them out, because now it's bash, now it's all the things that are MS build down there, right? So again, it's, what is it actually doing, right? And yes, you're going to see command lines that get encoded. There are methods to actually look into those, but I would generally say if your engineer in an organization isn't doing encoded command lines from their binaries, it's a great place to like just blanket make a statement. Now, if they are, that's going to be a little different. And I think to Phil's point, you're going to need granularity on your suppression on those, so you can actually find the evil when it pops up.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's definitely, you know, think about what's normal in your environment, and a lot of times those things that they're doing to obfuscate is not normal. So, you know, obfuscated, you know, base 64 encoded commands in PowerShell. That's not normal in a lot of places.
Yeah. I don't care what they're doing. I'm interested.
I have seen software packages do that, so it's not unheard of. But yeah.
But again,
yeah,
that feeds back
you know,
nicely
you can start to set standards around that too, right? So that your engineering team is in line with, like, you can actually use MITRE ATT&CK to test whether or not they're writing binaries that kick off APT type behavior. So you may want to use that as an education point for your software devs too.
Yeah, certainly. And bundling together multiple detectors, you know, seeing a long base 64 encoded PowerShell string in conjunction with dropping a binary that's unsigned, in conjunction with et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You bundle all those things together and you get this very interesting consolidated picture of, this is very, very interesting to me. One of those things alone might be just a little bit interesting or pique your curiosity, but you put them all together and you're going to be in, you know, you're definitely be in investigation mode at that point. Good question. Let's see. There's a couple other ones in here that I want to try and get to. You know, there's a question about the best way to deal with when attackers use legitimate operating system binaries. I think that goes back to what we were saying with PowerShell. You know, in conjunction with other behaviors, things look bad. We don't always just want to use a single detector. We want to get as many of those together as we possibly can. So that gives you the you know, better view here. Oh, here's a good one, and I'm excited for this one actually. How important is it for companies to understand their threat maturity model? What's the best way to get started to understand where you are today? Either of you guys want to take that? I've got some thoughts, but I'm interested in yours first.
John, you want to go first?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm just thinking make sure I say this the right way. So I think it is very important to understand where exactly you stand, mostly because that tells you the things that you should be doing next. And so when you start to look at where you stand in terms of hunting maturity, the question is, A, where am I now? But I think more importantly is, where can I be tomorrow with, you know, X level of investment in time or money? And so to me, it's less about measuring yourself for the sake of measuring yourself and saying, hey, I'm, you know, maturity level 4 and that's awesome. It's more, you know, I'm maturity level 4 and that means to get to the next level is I need to do this. And so it's really about making it an actionable measurement for me, at least.
Yeah, that actually covers the way that I was going to phrase it as well. But go ahead, Rick, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say, I'll take an outside in look, right? So yeah, purple teaming. I'll say that like 5 times. Red team and blue team sitting together, actually putting together, like if you want to do APT actor emulation, because that's applicable to your environment. A lot of that's going to come from sharing with your fellow community members that are in that particular vertical. So yeah, be realistic about it and then test for it.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, I think it all starts with, you know, what do you want your enterprise or your organization to be? You know, maybe based on your threat profile that you've chosen, you know, selected for yourself, calculated out, maybe getting all the way to that level 4 is something that isn't going to be worth that added investment. You know, there's obviously a payoff that's got to be had as well. So I think it just becomes a really good way to commonly evaluate against known standards, basically where you are, and as you guys both said, where you want to go. Let's see, another one in here. There's 2 questions on the lateral movement. I'm going to make an attempt here to combine them together. First question is, what are the best ways to identify lateral movement? And then the follow on to that is, do you think blocking PowerShell and WMI solves your lateral movement problem? I have some definite thoughts on both of those. I'll start it out by saying, there are dozens of ways to move laterally, and there's not going to be any one method that I think is going to be more or less effective across the board. It's going to be how comprehensive are your set of mechanisms for detecting lateral movement. So you're looking for logins between clients within your Windows environment. You're looking for large volumes of traffic, maybe between endpoints that don't typically communicate to each other. Those are going to be just two of probably a dozen ways we could rattle off real quick. So I would say that blocking, anything, regardless of what the individual binaries or capabilities might be, isn't necessarily going to be enough, because attackers are creative. You're dealing with human beings that are pretty dedicated here. So I think they're going to have mechanisms, just a long list rather, of them that are going to be able to accomplish that. So I think looking at it across the board in many different mechanisms, like designated in the attack matrix, I think is a good approach. But what other ones have you guys seen be the most effective ways in an advanced attacker type of a situation?
No, I think you nailed most of them. I would caution that lateral movement is changing a bit. So you're starting to see that come in from business partners and your supply chain. So you will still need some network telemetry as well to put that together. Yeah, but for me, largely, if you're talking desktops and server environments, it's going to come down to those network connections that are going amongst the systems. And no, I would say as soon as you stop paying attention to PowerShell, start paying attention to WMI, they're going to go back to it. We've clearly seen cases where you have 10,000 infected systems, PowerShell's running around, and WMI kind of sleeps until it detects that that first channel was closed down, and then it pops open, right? So going back to the right data and being able to put those behaviors together, I think is more important than focusing on one tool that the attackers are using.
Yeah, I think to your point, Rick, it's really important to understand, to stay up to date on what the attackers are doing, and watch your threat intelligence, watch what goes into attack. We have an attack content update coming up soon. Like, what are the new lateral movement techniques that come out with that, and do you have a mechanism to detect those things? So it's really, I think, a holistic approach versus any one thing, though. I mean, obviously there are those very common ones. That's a good place to
start. Well, and it goes back to the TTPs, right? That's why they're a durable means of detecting if you have the telemetry and the data to do that. Here's one that actually, this might be a quick one, but I think it's a good one for some folks who are new to attack. John, I was wondering if you could speak to a question we got about, if this is somebody who's looking at attack for the first time, what's a good place to start to really get some quick wins, some value, maybe some executive buy-in on continuing the work with attack before getting really deep into the weeds? Do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think a really good approach to start with is, from your own perspective, just dig into one of the technique pages and kind of understand what it's telling you and what attack is, and also what attack isn't. And that will help you understand how to approach communicating about it. And then the second thing is, when you're looking to demonstrate value with attack, I think the best thing to do is use a heat map. People love color-coded charts, and I think the great thing about an attack heat map is that it is based on adversary data, and so it's not an unrealistic assessment of something. And so what you could do is you could do a quick spend a day putting together, go through each technique and say, how do I think our stock would handle this one? How do I think we would handle this one? And kind of do that assessment. And that could not be a huge investment for you, and you could show something to others pretty quickly, and then kind of take it from there. Obviously, that assessment you shouldn't put too much weight in, because it's just you. But that's one approach you could take. I'd be curious if either of you, though, have thoughts on how how did you first start looking at attack, and where would you recommend people start?
No, I kind of love what you said there, but if you were interested and you said, what are the two most common things that bad guys are doing out there? I'll tell you, lateral movement and credential harvesting, right? So for me, it's like, hey, they're almost always gonna take your credentials. So maybe focus a team on that. But I like this approach of just talking it through with your team first. It's a similar approach to what you do with business continuity and disaster recovery. You have that table talk exercise first. You go, oh, we think we're going to have a really hard time detecting this particular thing, so let's go invest some resources in it. Sometimes that's going to be byproduct. Sometimes it's going to be you just need a better detector for the product you have.
Yeah, definitely. I remember one of the first things that I'd done was, looked at it. It's pretty overwhelming at first if you're not really kind of familiar with what the framework is designed to do. And I just picked out like 2 or 3 of them that I'm like, okay, I understand what that is. I don't remember what they were, but I just picked those couple of them. And I said, how do I know if this actually happened? What data do I have? What evidence is already collected that's going to help me to know, did this thing potentially occur? And I just kind of use that as a, I'm minimizing my learning curve here by using, methods, the behaviors that I'm familiar with, evidence that I already know I have. and then trying to apply that. And then that kind of opened up the floodgates, if you will, of, oh man, if I had this other evidence, I could detect some of this other stuff that's on here, and really started to get the creative juices flowing. And that was kind of I think a really good, again, going back to that crawl, walk, run approach, where you're experimenting on an easy data set first and kind of growing from there. I wanted to mention real quick, I still have a couple more of the questions I'm going to go through. Again, this is all being recorded, so you're going to get the link in your email. I know there's been a couple of those questions, but we also in the chat here given you links to register for parts 2 and 3 of the webinar. We've got different folks who'll be talking, giving you a lot of new perspectives on each. So we're super excited for that, and hopefully you can join us for it. And in addition, one of the questions that came in here, best way to get informed when attack updates are made. I know the answer to that, but I am going to ask John to pipe in real quick on that one.
You know, Twitter is the best way. The people doing the MITRE Twitter account are on top of things, and that's really your best way of finding out. We are also, I want to give a plug out, we're launching a new website in the next coming weeks. Could be kind of a redesign and based more on structured data. And so we're really excited about that. With that, we're launching a new blog. So you'll get to hear from myself and the other team members. We have some really smart folks on adversary emulation and CTI. And that'll be a great place also to follow along for, you know, attack updates.
And you guys have a conference coming up too, right?
We do. We have a conference coming up at the end of October. We're closed on registration right now. You can sign up for the wait list, but all of that's also going to be streamed for free. So please take a look. You can just search for ATT&CK is what we're calling that.
Cool.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that was going to all be streamed free. That's great to hear, because I know in speaking with some of your folks the other week that you got some really good talks that are there.
Yep.
Let's see. Let's see. What's another good question we've got in here? Let's see. Oh, here's one on data retention. You know, this is an interesting one. We got a minute for this one that we can still hit, and then I think we might be able to get maybe one after that. But what are recommendations for recording history? So I'm reading that as data retention, to be able to look back. I always say that, you know, that's usually something that's determined more by the attorneys than by the technical folks, because if we had our druthers, we would just exhaust storage and then buy more with data collection. But let's look at that through the lens of like threat intelligence. Rick, do you have any thoughts on based on the current kind of fleet of threat intelligence that's coming out, or do you have any thoughts on what data retention is typically going to be needed for today's advanced attacker?
Yeah, for the advanced attackers, I mean, just IOCs, you should just consider them disposable, completely disposable. That's going to change like minute to minute sometimes. Patterns and behaviors are going to be much harder to change, right? So I think we've talked about that. So they become, and I like this word, Phil, I'm going to steal it, durable, more durable. So it's going to be longer lasting, right? In regards to data retention, yes, I think there are legal and regulatory components to that. But some of it's going to be specific to your environment and your process. And I can't give you the medicine without actually like sitting down and understanding a bit more. It's just hard for me to give like a blanket statement. Hey, it's always 90 days, right? It's always 120 days.
Right.
What I can tell you is the longer we can start to keep these chains together, the more likely we are to find some attacks we probably haven't seen before. Because as we know, they are going low and slow in a lot of these advanced cases. So look, if I was a smaller shop, and you know, I hesitate to give like blanket. If I was a smaller shop, I would say shorter retention. If I'm an enterprise that's deeply concerned about APT, I would say retain as long as possible and cull the data as necessary.
Cool. Yeah, and I didn't mean to put you on the spot with like looking for a specific number there. You know,
yeah, no, it's just, and it is part of the consideration for building an effective hunting and detection program, right? And so talk to people, talk to the community, reach out to us. Right. I mean, I think we're all available on Twitter and LinkedIn and email and all those things. So I'll give you the best advice I can give you.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I certainly agree. And you know, I think that it's something that is also going to be informed by that threat intelligence. You know, you're going to get an intel report on some new threat actor or old threat actor, as the case might be. And if you find out that they've had a dwell time in certain environments of years, it may cause you to reevaluate your data retention policy. So I think that becomes a part of that continuous cycle of reevaluating your usefulness of your programs, plural, against the adversaries that you're facing. Let's see if we got one more that we can get in the time here. Actually, we just flipped over to 2 p.m. I want to be respectful of everybody's time because I realize that you're in many different time zones and such. There's a couple more of these that I'm going to try to capture through the platform if we can do that. If you didn't see the links to register, or if you're watching this recorded and you didn't have a chance to see the chat, do check our Twitter accounts. We're all easy to find on that, both corporate as well as individuals, and we'd be happy to make sure you get those links so you can register. We're going to have lots and lots of buzz leading up to that, so watch Twitter, watch mailing lists, etc. We're going to make sure that that you don't miss the next couple when they're coming up. And by that token, I will give you the schedule for this one. It'll be October 2nd, so mark your calendars, October 2nd at 1 p.m. Eastern time. And we're going to have another great group of folks. My colleagues Adam and Joe from Red Canary, and Jimmy from Carbon Black is going to be in there as well. And they're going to really be talking about that testing capability, the refinement and the measurement. Basically, how do you evaluate the effectiveness of your program overall? So really excited for that one, and I hope you are as well. But if there's anything else, by all means, reach out. Guys, you want to say anything real quick in closing?
No, jump into it. That's the best advice I can give you right now is just get in there and start small and then expand your program.
Yeah, I agree. This community has been awesome to me. I think they've been awesome to everybody, really. I've learned so much from the Red Canary blogs and from Carbon Black as well. The whole community here is great. So yeah, definitely jump in and ask questions. You won't get in trouble for that.
No, not at all. Well, that's the time that we've got for today. I'm going to jump off webcam, but I'm going to stay on the line. So if you've got a burning question that's still in the queue that I didn't get a chance to get to, my apologies on that. I'm going to try to answer as many of those as I can here in the chat with you directly. But I want to give big thanks to John, to Rick for joining me today, certainly to the broader teams that we've got behind the scenes bringing this material to you. Hope you have a great rest of your day wherever you might be, and we hope to see you at the next one on October 2nd. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a good one.